Kia ora tātou. Welcome back to our reading of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And at the end of chapter 4 we got up to where Edmund and Lucy had come back through the wardrobe after being in Narnia and are going to tell the others about their adventures. And chapter 5 is called Back on This Side of the Door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armour was, Lucy burst out, "Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there, in the wood. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it." "What's this all about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in this story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan, and Edmund gave a rather superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference. And then a little snigger and said, "Oh yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe is true, just for fun, of course. There's nothing there really." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success and went on at once to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," said Edmund, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when she left home, but since we've been down here she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into a most frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and encouraging her the next?" "Oh, I thought," said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You didn't think at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now." "Do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go and find Lucy." It was not surprising that when they found Lucy, a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, "I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there, and you are all beasts, beasts." It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers long after she'd gone to bed. The result was, the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. "He'll write to father if he thinks there is really something wrong with Lou," said Peter. "It's getting beyond us." So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, "Come in," and got up and found chairs for them, and said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting, till they'd finished the whole story. After that he said nothing for quite a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either of them expected. "How do you know," he asked, "that your sister's story is not true?" There's a picture of them telling the professor, Susan, and the older brother Peter. "Oh, but," began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, "But Edmund said they'd only been pretending." "That is a point," said the professor, "which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you'll excuse me for asking the question, Does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, who is the more truthful? That's just the funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up until now I'd have said Lucy every time. And what do you think, my dear? Said the Professor, turning to Susan. Well, said Susan, in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true. All this about the wood and the fawn. That is more than I know, said the Professor, and a charge of lying against someone whom you've always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed. We were afraid it mightn't even be lying, said Susan. We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean, said the Professor quite coolly. Oh, I can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she is not mad. But then, said Susan and stopped. She'd never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the Professor and didn't know what to think.